Good morning. It is absolutely a pleasure to welcome you all for this very interesting webinar on quality of life for the elderly. We have three very special guests out here for the interaction or for the webinar. We have Dr. Vivek Debroy, who's the chairman for the EACPM, Dr. Dar Singh, who's the former Secretary General for FICCI, and we have Dr. Sajid Chinoy, who is the Chief India Economist for JP Morgan. In fact, what is it that we are really trying to do here today is that we are trying to understand the whole aspect of quality of life for the elderly. And why are we even dabbling into this area? This has been a very interesting question of aging that we have been really talking about. And this is what we really wanted to look at. And as we were going through this whole idea of aging, the aspects of quality of life for elderly, Dr. Debroy told us that why don't we do an index here, or why don't we do an in-depth study? In fact, what we are really doing here is that we are really trying to share some of the thoughts that we have from the index of or index on quality of life for elderly and from the report itself. But there are some very interesting insights and very interesting rankings that have emerged and how states are functioning. But first and foremost, I think it was Dr. Debroy's idea that this whole thing has really come about, and we are thankful for him for this opportunity. Having said that, I really wanted to share some of the ideas from the report. In fact, we'll just do a very quick presentation on the report and just move forward to the discussion. So, yeah. So if you really look at this whole idea of quality of life, the question that we were really trying to understand is like, how do we care for our graying elderly? And when you talk about caring for the graying elderly, the question here was that what are the kind of numbers that we actually have in India for the elderly? The number that we are really seeing is that we are going to have close to about 320 million people by 2050 who are going to be over the age of 60. So that means we are going to be rapidly aging. Of course, we do talk about the aspect of demographic dividend, but there is something that we really need to look deeper, and that is the idea of how aging is going to happen. In fact, the aged population, that is people over the age of 60, will double over the next 2 to 3 decades. So that means there is going to be a huge challenge that we have to really look at. But besides this, so if you really look at these numbers, this is something very interesting in terms of elderly in India. Over 10% of India's population is over 60, 139 million in 2019, and 19.5% of India's population by 2050. So this is one thing that I was looking at. But quite interestingly, the difference in demographic trends across Indian states are also very unique. It is not that we are going to have similar sets of growth rates or similar sets of age profiles across different set of states. It is going to be different across different set of states. Kerala is going to be one of the most aged states as we look at. UP, of course, is going to be one of the younger ones in 2036. But of course, that is because of the larger population and such things. And of course, Bihar is also going to be younger. So what we might actually see is that you might end up seeing some economic effect or economic opportunities here as well. So you will have some very young population in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, so they could also be drivers for economic growth. But having said that, it does not mean that we are going to have some kind of a negative impact across other states. And then there is going to be differences in old age dependency ratio across states. But what are the challenges of aging in India? There are 3 or 4 big things that actually emerge. One is the feminization of aging. When we call it as feminization of aging, it is that you're going to have far greater number of women who are going to be over the age of 60 than men. Of course, this is accentuated through the whole idea of death rates and the longevity and how long we live. But these are some very important aspects that we need to look at. In fact, even today, the average age the average age in India for women and men, there is a difference of about 5 to 6 years. So that is one thing that is going to really come up. Income security is another issue that we have to really understand. The second thing is about integration of elderly in economy. And when we talk about integration of elderly in economy, the question is that how do we really get the best for them? What we have really seen until now is that we have moved people. We always seen the people retire at the age of something like say 60 or whatever. But the question here is going to be that how do we really get the best for them? How do we really include them in the process of economic development or economic activity? And there is a very important aspect, and I think for this I must really say that it was Dr. De Broglie who just picked up a question. In fact, he just asked me, like, if you really look at the actuarial tables that were created, they were created in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s data. And that's when I really understood, like, like when you talk about retirement age, it is based on the longevity data or average life expectancy data from the early 1900s. It is not something which is reflective of the kind of development that has actually happened until now. So there is a bigger question that we have to look at is in terms of whether we should retire early and such things. Healthcare and services is going to be an important aspect that we have to look at. But other than that, I think this is where we come down to the index on quality of life for elderly. One important aspect is like when you talk about quality of life, it is about how well are we really looking at most of the things. And there are these four things that we really want to understand. One is, of course, financial well-being, social well-being, health system, or income security. And if you really look at it, this is across these sets of pillars, we wanted to understand on aspects of how it gels for the people over the age of 60. And we looked at this data. So we looked at 4 pillars, 8 sub-pillars, and 45 indicators. Again, the set of data that we looked at was from the governmental sources, so that we really wanted to be sure that the data is right, vetted, verified, and that's how it was looked at. So this was the broad set of indicators. I would request all of you who are there on the webinar and who watch this later to really come back and see all the indicators that we have actually looked at. We have tried to really make sure that it becomes a fairly good representation of what is really happening with the elderly across the board. It does map very well to the SDG goals, but there are some very key, interesting key findings, and this is where I wanted to share the interesting key findings. Like, of course, like where is Rajasthan stacked up? Rajasthan in the aged states. When we say aged states, like states wherein you have people over 5 million over the age of 60. So Rajasthan is ranked number 1, Maharashtra at 2, and Telangana at 10. So these are the states wherein you have people over 5 million over the age of 60. Relatively aged states, less than 5 million, and this is where we have Himachal as number 1 and Gujarat at number 10. And for the northeastern states, we have Mizoram at 1 and Arunachal at 8. And this is the kind of things. But the best place from the Union Territory point of view for the people who are over the age of 60 seems to be Chandigarh. And this again is from a quality of life perspective that we have. This is how the rankings really stack up. But the most important factor that I really wanted to share is that when you talk about the country, we see huge variation across different sets of indicators or across different sets of pillars. And that variation is very huge. So that means if we really look at this as a policy tool, or if we really look at it as an assessment tool, it becomes important that we see that there are differences that actually exist between different sets of states, and we can actually look at moving towards a frontier. And that's the challenge that everyone should possibly look at. And some of the policy recommendations that we have, they're across the board, from financial well-being to health system to income security, and so on and so forth. So very quickly, I'll run through these things. So digital literacy, subsidized healthcare, income security, universal pension, food security, and things, and reskilling of the elderly. But something very important that we did see is that we did create a scorecard for the states. And this is where I think it becomes imperative that if states do look at the scorecard, they would be able to see as to where is it that they are lagging behind, and what is it that they can actually do to really improve over a period of time. And so if you really look at economic empowerment, we do see that in economic empowerment, Delhi is lagging behind. So we really need to see as to how we can just improve over a period of time and take it forward. So this is the broad level of scorecards, but this I'm sure can be used as a tool for assessing. This can actually be used as a tool for CSR activities as well, in terms of how we can really make investments. So across the board, it does give some insights. So these are the broad level insights that we actually have from the index. But then, in fact, what we are here for is for an interaction with Dr. Debroy, Dr. Chinoy, and Dr. Didar Singh. In fact, without further ado, I think we should just dive into the conversation. Dr. Debroy, first and foremost, I must personally thank you for really helping us or giving support for doing this index. But what do you think was the driver for really doing this?
Thank you, Amit, and thank you, Didar and Sajid, for having agreed to join in on this discussion. Let me step back a little bit from the report first, and then I'll come back to the report. The Prime Minister, all of us, we've been talking about ease of doing business. Ease of doing business is about enterprise. The Prime Minister has also spoken about ease of living, which is not about the enterprise, it is about the citizen. From the moment a person is born to the point in time when a person dies, procedures and compliances must be simple. And all of us are familiar with the hassles associated with getting a birth certificate. They have come down, yes, but they used to be hassles. And similarly, all of us are familiar with the problems associated with getting a death certificate. In the midst of COVID, there's a lot of discussion about the number of COVID deaths. One issue is what the death is due to. The other issue is whether the death is being registered. Both of these are mandatory under the law. Birth registration is dramatically shot up across all states. Death registration still lags. I am now the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And I'm not divulging any great secret. I'm over 60. A few years ago, my CA tells me, you no longer have to file advance tax. I said, why not? He said, oh, because you're a senior citizen now. And it was a shock to me. I'm supposed to be still working and I'm a senior citizen under the law. There is a respected economist whose name I will not mention. Some 10 years ago, he told me, Vivek, you know, when I was 50, I wondered when the old fogies will get out of the way. Now that I'm 70, I realize how much I still have to contribute to society. I know a person, a gentleman. Traditionally, when we have property, in our wills and testaments, we leave it to the son, which is what he did. He didn't expect to live that long. But then he lived longer. The son grew up, so he's not left it. He changed the will, left it to his grandson. But he's lived longer still. The grandson has also grown up, and the last time I met him, he's changed the will again and left it to his great-grandson. Many of our mindsets are still based on a life expectancy of 27, questionable figures at the time of independence, and 31 at the time of 1951. But there is a great deal of variation amongst various parts, and there are parts of India, slices of society, where the average life expectancy, some segments of society, is not very different from what it is in many advanced countries. So if you don't look at life expectancy at birth, but look at life expectancy at age 60, it is quite amazing what is happening. Now, all of this is happening in a society which is going through a very fast period of economic change, is also going through a very fast period of demographic transition. When demographic transition is compressed across is spread over 3 or 4 generations, the social security system as a collective entity delivers. Here is a country which is described as a young country. It has a demographic dividend, but it's also a country that is rapidly aging and will age even more so beyond 2030 and beyond 2035. There is a lot of talk about the demographic dividend. There is not all that much attention devoted to the problem of the aged, and this is a problem that will hit us in all states soon. It is already a problem that has affected some states which have gone through demographic transition earlier, but this demographic transition will follow in other countries, in other states. All states will have to go through this. So that is when we requested Dr. Amit Kapoor and the Institute of Competitiveness to do a report for us. To do a report for us, obviously, when they were going to do a report for us, they could not possibly capture everything under the sun because you can only measure things on which you have data. And on data also, as he said, to avoid controversies, you need to use data that is government data, that is vetted data. And this is exactly what we have here today. It is an index. Any index has absolute scores, and it also has ranks because it ranks states. Many years ago, when I was in the business of ranking states, I discovered that whenever I said some states, half the states are below average, people would get upset. So I switched to saying half the states are above average, and everyone seemed to be happy. So like that, here we have absolute scores. It's a detailed report which will be put up on the website. It will be publicly disclosed. Half the states are above average. What hopefully this does is, as any state ranking does, is it focuses attention. And when I say focuses attention, I don't really mean only government, because there are several things that are beyond government, that transcend government. They affect the way we think of the old in a society, in the collective entity, including things like retirement ages, reskilling for people who are 60, and so on and so forth. So here is the report. I deliberately requested Amit to change the structure of presentation of the report. This is experimental. So instead of thick tomes that no one reads, the report itself looks and resembles a bit like a PPT. That is deliberately so, because although academically it is absolutely sound, we wanted it to convey an impression so that people actually read it. So that is the background for the report, which is being launched today. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you, Dr. Debroy. And this is, this has been a very fascinating exercise in terms of like the experimentation as well that we have done on how this whole data has to be portrayed, etc. And it was very challenging. But having said that, Dr. Debroy, just going deeper into this whole conversation. Of course, like you just said, that India is seen as a young nation, but of course there are challenges that we see. What do you think would be the biggest challenge from your point of view of aging that India sees? Like, is it going to be social, or is it going to be more economic, or is it going to be a combination of the two?
There are health challenges. There are problems of accessing health services. And we know those are concentrated more in some regions and some states than in others. But that in some sense is age neutral, although it probably affects the elderly the most. I think the biggest challenge is one of income security. And I'm using the word income security within quotes because it means all kinds of different things. It means pensions. And when I'm saying all this, I'm not talking about people who are targeted beneficiaries, because people who are targeted beneficiaries, especially in rural India, that they receive various benefits from the government. I'm talking about a slightly different segment, not necessarily rural, urban, semi-urban, where you have an income issue coupled with the fact that the traditional social support that existed in the form of the joint family system, it has collapsed. So I've met a large number of people who expected, not large, I've met several people who expected to live till the age of 70. And at that time, they invested their money in fixed deposits because that was the safe avenue. And they planned accordingly. Understandably, the rates of return on FDs have come down, have been eroded by inflation. And now that they realize that they're going to live till the age of 80, they are effectively eroding their capital. The sons and daughters have migrated, sometimes not just within India, but also abroad. So I would say safety, income security, social security, if you want to choose to call it, is the biggest challenge. The health one is there, but the health one is more or less a universal problem across age spectrums.
So something like what Dr. Debroy is saying is very, very important for us to see. So Sajid, I would like to get you in here into the conversation. So, you know, like when Dr. Debroy says that, of course, there are cultural changes that are happening. There are how we are really making savings, or there are some financial behavioral changes that we are seeing. And of course, it actually has huge effect on income security. Things. So these are some challenges. How do you really look at these challenges, or do you feel that there is something much more beyond this that we see?
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. Thank you very much for starters for having me here. I want to thank Dr. Debroy for commissioning this study, because very often we're forced to think about challenges that affect us today or tomorrow. It's nice to be able to discuss challenges that will affect us tomorrow and day after tomorrow. And let me also start by congratulating Dr. Amit Kapoor and his team at the Institute of Competitiveness for a very comprehensive report. As somebody famously once said, what you can't measure, you can't improve. And so it's very nice to have a simple index, and yet one that's multidimensional. And as you said, it will focus attention on what states need to do to reach the frontier. Needless to say, I think as data evolves, the index will be refined, but this is a great starting point. When you speak about challenges, I just want to sort of wear my macro hat here, step back and think about the macro challenges that aging poses, and then talk about some behavioral implications, both with and without policy. If you just take the static view of the world, what you will see is that an aging society means definitionally labor force participation rates will fall. We know as people get older, savings rates fall. And so both of these things, at least from a static accounting perspective, means that potential growth will fall down the line. In fact, if you think about some of the growth pessimism that involves developed markets, it really centers around aging societies. The second kind of macro implication that we need to focus on is the fiscal. And I think the report touches upon this in various places, saying that we will find that, social security, as Dr. Debroy put it, pension liabilities will increase, either directly increase or contingent liabilities will increase. Healthcare costs may go up. We know on the revenue side, if the working age population is lower, that could have implications on taxes. So, there will be fiscal pressures that emerge from aging society. So on paper, this is an unenviable situation to be in, where on the one hand, as societies age, potential growth slows and fiscal obligations rise. But I think the implications for policy are behavioral. We spoke about, as people live longer and healthier lives, can we consider increasing the retirement age? Now, this is also a personal choice, but it has implications, as we've seen in very developed economies, about how we treat pension programs. Several developed economies have struggled to de facto increase the retirement age because pension programs have not been calibrated accordingly. And the political economy constraint rises as the percent of elderly in the population rise, from pushing out retirement benefits, for example. So these are issues we need to grapple with today, to say, we do want people with longer and healthier lives to work more. It helps personally, it helps economically. How do we change the socio-economic incentives to make that happen, quite apart from the retraining, reskilling, digitization that the report talks about? The other behavioral impact, I would argue, is on labor force participation. The report eloquently talks about the feminization of aging. And I would argue that one secular trend in India has been labor force participation of women has secularly fallen. So one easy way to combat this is to start thinking about how do we increase labor force participation of women so that when you have a more aged population, at least LFP rates, especially of women, are higher. Now, COVID, in a strange way, by facilitating increased technological adoption, work from home, will trigger that for women. And I think we need to build on some of the learnings from COVID. The third thing will be, from my perspective, enabling formalization. I think the particular challenge in India is that we have a large informal workforce that doesn't have any social security, no formal pensions, and as they age, this will have acute implications for quality of life and becomes a very clear contingent fiscal liability for the state. So again, promoting formalization now, so workers are into formal enterprises, have some security net that they're planning for, will help. And the fourth, I think, is just thinking about fiscal dynamics. 10, 20 years from now, where will this fiscal space come from as we get progressively older? How do we plan for these? I would not say contingent liabilities. There's certain liabilities. They're simply deferred liabilities. Here, I think, Dr. Kapoor, the report can make an interesting addition because, as you correctly pointed out, that the rate at which different states are aging is very different. And so these fiscal pressures will emerge to different degrees at different points in time. And because you have information about demographic profiles of different states, maybe one can begin to create some index of fiscal needs in different states when they start kicking in, so that this then enters the discussion when we think about fiscal roadmaps, when the Finance Commission is considering this, when we think about fiscal rules, when we think about debt sustainability. So in a way, all of these from a macro perspective, I think will need to be considered. I'll just end by saying that I think most of all, this in a way underscores the imperative of harnessing the demographic dividend that we currently have, maximizing growth rates while labor force participation rates are high. And I think, the one line from the report that sums it all up is, you say the results of our analysis indicate that the best way to improve the lives of the current and future generations of older people is by investing in health, education, and employment for young people today. I think this is the surest way to get rich before we get old.
Yes, Sajid, this is very, very insightful. But just a quick question here. Like when you are talking about that, there are going to be, we have to really look at the fiscal measures that we are really looking at. And if we don't start on time, we are actually talking about larger sets of challenges. And you do, of course, allude to the fact that we have to start now. How do we create that level of urgency in the minds of people that this is something that we have to really look at now? In fact, when you talk about aging, we are not aging so rapidly as Japan, which could end up being a society which no longer exists, or as a race, they might not exist after 2100. We are not there, but I think there is a bigger challenge of how do we really set things right? So how do we create that urgency?
Yes, I think on the fiscal front, Dr. Kapoor, if we create some kind of fiscal index where we talk about what these liabilities are going to look like for different states in time to come, and you then marry that with what we know about the debt dynamics of different states, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in those debt dynamics, that I think will focus the mind of various state policymakers, because the combination of these will result in quite alarming outcomes down the line. Not for all states, for some states. We already know debt dynamics are on a, on a monotonically increasing path for several states. This is even without taking into account contingent liabilities, future pension liabilities, increased healthcare spending. So I think if we can do that at the state level, quite apart from catching up on the frontier for the other dimensions, the 4 pillars that you spoke about, states will have something very tangible to work with to say, if this is what the debt dynamics look like over the next 10 years, what do we need to do now? And I think then the conversation begins to enter the next Finance Commission, when we talk about subnational fiscal rules, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Sajid. We will come back to you, but Dr. Singh, Dr. Didar Singh, like looking at what is really happening in India in terms of, say, one is, of course, we are talking about an aging society, and we are talking about huge numbers emerging in the next 20 to 30 years, which is going to be a challenge. And of course, as Dr. Debroy was saying, and as Sajid was as well saying, that it is that we are talking about social issues, we are talking about infrastructural issues that will actually emerge. How do you really think that we should act now? What is it that we need to do as of today?
Thank you, Amit, for asking for my opinion. Let me first begin by mentioning that India has 100 problems, and we always look at government to solve those problems. This is not the case, and this cannot be the case forever. But however, before getting into this whole debate, let me first compliment you. It's an excellent report, and it's probably the first one that's ever been done. So really compliments to you that you put it on a state-wise categorization, and this will help in many, many ways, as Ajit has just mentioned. It will help in ensure that there is a fiscal needs are now put more clearly and people can address them in some manner or the other. Having said that, let me also, like Vivek Debroy, take this debate beyond just India and beyond just your report. Item number 1. What is the definition of elderly? This definition itself is shifting. Please don't fix a permanent definition of elderly as so-called over 60 or whatever that India defines. That is not the definition. And why do I say it's not the definition? Recent research is showing that the most productive years in a person's life are between 60 to 70. Vivek, that's you. Between 60 to 70 are the most productive years. The second most productive years are 70 to 80. And the third most productive years are 50 to 60. So the whole demographic itself is changing. Please understand that what we consider as elderly today may be your single most important resource. And we need to look at that in a manner totally different. Not just India, the whole world needs to look at it in a different manner. And that brings me to the need for reskilling. The report talks about it, but there is a tremendous impact that is happening right now on all jobs. That impact is technology. Technology is changing jobs as we know them. The elderly can possibly step in many of those places using that technology. Therefore, in other words, what is my recommendation? Use the elderly in places where technology is impacting jobs. And here it's not just government that has to do it. The private sector itself must do lots of this to ensure that this actually happens. Now, there are a whole lot of Government of India schemes, but to me the most important, and here is my answer to the question you asked Vivek Amit ji. You asked, is it a social issue or is it an economic issue? To me, the single most important issue is an economic issue. And therefore, your suggestion of what you refer to as the universal pension income is a very good suggestion, and I hope that at some stage we are able to actually implement it. It's very difficult for a poor country like India to do it, but it's something worth looking at because that is the single most important key to this entire issue of aging. However, let me now look at the larger context of family as we know it. Many countries in Asia, including India, have depended largely on the concept of family. The elderly are looked after by the joint family. Is that changing? Is that globally changing? Is it changing in Asia? Is it changing in India? We need to understand the impact of urbanization on the concept of family. That is a very important aspect. And finally, I'll end only by saying that globally, this whole issue of aging is not an India issue. It's actually much more in Europe, USA, and China, which is leading to major migration. Migration has become a very hot topic around the world, mainly because of aging. Because there are not enough people to fill the jobs. And so countries like India are supplying a very large labor force around the world and will continue to do this at least for the next 20 to 25 years. Because we're the only people with the demographic dividend to be able to do it. I'll end with that, with these initial remarks, and welcome to question or answer any of the questions that you may raise, Amit ji or anybody else. Thank you.
Sure. And so, Dr. Singh, just a quick question here. You made a very important point, and that is about the role of the private sector. I think a lot of us will always harp on the idea that government needs to do everything under the sun. How do you think private sector can get involved here? Like, one is, of course, they can look at retirement ages and things, but what more can the private sector do?
First of all, let us look at the formal economy and then we look at the informal economy. Formal economy is very clear. The private sector must upskill everyone in its workforce and also others. It must upskill migrants, it must upskill retired people, it must upskill everybody. Lifelong learning is the obvious thing that has to come into place. That is for the formal sector. Informal sector, it's a little bit more difficult. And here it merges with the social aspect of India, and it merges with our whole society and the concept of family that I raised earlier in the debate. This concept of looking after the elderly is something which has to become part of our culture. It is already part of our culture, but it has to be enforced by government and by the private sector in ensuring that it actually happens, and it happens all the time across the board. It's a very difficult one, but it has to happen. And you're right, ultimately we cannot depend only on government to solve all these issues. We must solve it ourselves. And finally, the most important part of solving it is individuals itself. We as individuals, we who are aging, must upskill ourselves, must get into lifelong learning, must have new things to offer the world, and be able to actually contribute to society in some manner. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Dr. Debroy, I would like to come to you at this stage. In fact, just following up from what Dr. Didar Singh was saying, in terms of the importance of the private sector, I think it does solve a lot of problems. And when I say private sector, it also has to be looked at, say, from the perspective of SDGs over a period of time, like because its sustainable development goals have to be achieved by 2030. There are some gaps that will need to be fulfilled. How do you really look at this challenge from the aspect of aging?
I'll answer that, but first let me just react to something that Sajid said. That looked at from the point of view of state governments, what he suggested is a very good idea. And certainly for the government, the figures exist. Whether those figures, I'm talking about state governments, whether those figures will be available to you or not is an issue we will have to figure out. But they're certainly available, and they were available to the 15th Finance Commission. Now, moving on to the broader issue that Didar has raised, whether we call it income security or pensions doesn't really matter. It's a stream of income I need to get at the end of the month. So let me just call it pensions for want of something better. It need not always be pensions. There is a question that's important for society. Who funds those pensions? And it is society who has to fund those pensions, which is easier when the demographic transition is slower. When the demographic transition is this fast, funding this socially is not going to be easy. Funding this socially means that if we want a scheme like this, then our effective tax rates would be close to what they are in the Scandinavian countries. As a society, are we willing to tolerate that? The second question that arises is, do we have a database that satisfactorily enables us to identify who should be the beneficiaries of this pension or universal income, whatever scheme? We have the beginnings of that in Aadhaar. There is a tweaking that needs to be done for Aadhaar, but Aadhaar still cannot be, in the absence of tweaking, cannot be used to deliver this kind of scheme. It can be tweaked, of course, and we need to identify and define clearly who are the aged. Having said this, what is the role of the government? The way I look at it is the role of the government is to only fund it for beneficiaries who cannot fund it. Whether it is using the SCCC or something like that, you cannot reasonably expect the government to run a pension scheme for every aged person in this country. It cannot happen. At best, the government can fund a premium which leads to the pensions in the future. But we are talking about an entire life cycle kind of thing. So the expectations on the part of the government, not purely for fiscal reasons, also for administrative reasons, have to be a bit more realistic, which is where Didar's point about private. Private does not mean corporate. It means all of us, essentially. As a society, we need to figure out how we are going to do this. And the challenge really is, to repeat an expression that both Didar and Sajid have used in different senses, we are looking to move to a formalized society from a society that is informal, but the informal systems of support have collapsed. And so therefore we are facing this uncertainty, churn, and problems in the process of this fast transition.
So, like Sajid, I would like to come back to you. In fact, from where Dr. Debroy is ending his comments, and that's a very startling point from my point of view. Or I feel that that's a point that we need to look at. Like, we are seeing some rapid changes from a cultural point of view in India. And so what Dr. Debroy was alluding to was that, of course, the family structures are changing. Probably we are moving from joint family to a nuclear family system. People are migrating, so there are going to be challenges. How do we understand that what are going to be the future changes that are going to happen? And in fact, I would like to bring in the whole aspect of COVID as well. We did talk about it. There is a lot of change that has happened because of COVID, and that change has happened at the place of work as to how people are really getting employed or how people are working. So that can also have huge implications for work and implications for the future. How do you really look at this aspect? Over to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor. No, exactly what you and Dr. Debroy said, and Dr. Singh had said, that we're seeing all these changes, greater urbanization, more nuclear families, some of those informal support systems that we've come to rely upon, understandably are coming under pressure in this rapidly developing economy, which is why there are other behavioral changes that hopefully we will need to incorporate. For example, as people realize that they're living longer and therefore will have a longer retired life, maybe their savings rates go up now in anticipation for creating a bigger pool of savings to draw down upon later. Exactly as you alluded to, getting more women into the workforce so that they're working now and are able to work for longer becomes very important. In this post-COVID world where people can work remotely, this is an ideal situation to trigger greater labor force participation, greater reskilling, greater education. You can be sitting at home and reskilling as an elder person. This is the time we should be thinking of, raising the retirement age. Of course, that has to be timed delicately here because you've got this big demographic dividend. So you want to time it judiciously. But I would argue that that would endogenously emerge in the private sector, because as the population ages and the private sector recognizes that there's a smaller pool of younger people and a larger pool of older, experienced people, I would expect that wages, relative wages, hiring decisions, premium and experience, all of this will result in the later longer working lives and later retirement dates. So I would argue that many of these older structures that are coming under pressure will need to be replaced by behavioral changes that will make this transition less daunting. Some of this, I would argue, will emerge endogenously from the private sector. As people save more towards longer lives, companies readjust their hiring patterns, there will be some market failures over here. There will be some market failures here if we can't move enough people from the informal to the formal economy. And it's that I think the government needs to start preparing for, both the central and state governments, anticipating which of these behavioral changes are not emerging in the private sector and where does the government need to nudge them. If I could just use this moment, Dr. Kapoor, to make just a couple of technical observations on an excellent report as next steps. If you give me 30 seconds, you have a distinction between the aged versus the relatively aged. which is on a 5 million cutoff. Maybe one addition to that could be using a percent of population. So we look at each state, look at the percent of aged population, and then maybe use a cutoff in terms of percentage of population rather than having an absolute cutoff, and see how the results may change over there. Secondly, you have a very interesting correlation between the level of GSDP and the quality of life index, and there's no obvious correlation. One suggestion or innovation there could be, rather than using the level of GDP, which is more a stock variable, is to use growth rates of GDP at the state level, because that is more reflective of dynamism at the state level, and see if you find some correlation between GSDP growth rates, a 3-year average, a 5-year average, with this quality of life index. And third, I would argue that perhaps some of these correlations need to be conditional on the relative share of the old. So if once you control for the relative share of the old in each state, then are we finding a correlation between growth rates and quality of life? And finally, what's intriguing, I'll end with this, is you have a very interesting correlation which shows the proportion of the elderly population is negatively correlated, if I got it right, with the quality of index, of quality of living index. That worries me, because that prima facie tells me that as the proportion of the aged grows, we're not delivering on some of these sub-indices or indices, and that just puts presents the challenge going forward even more starkly. That currently, if you look at the cross-section of states, what you're suggesting is, as the proportion of the age has grown, that quality of life index has actually reduced, if I read the correlation correctly. And that has quite haunting implications for the country as a whole as we all age.
Yeah.
Can I just say something on this? I think, see, it is correlation, but to put it somewhat indelicate terms, the issue is there are some states where we know governance has not been all that good, whatever be the indicator you use. And this includes health services, various other services, life and limb, all of that. And the aging is happening now in some of those states. So in that sense, it's correlation, but I think the causation is somewhere else. But that's my reaction. You should react.
No, I think I'll agree with Dr. Debroy on this, but some amazing points, Sajid, and I think as a way forward, we really need to look at this, I think, as to how things are changing. Because when you say that GDP is a stock variable and we should really look at growth rates, I think we should rather do this, because it's a great suggestion. We need to understand as to how growth rates are happening and how it is going to affect the quality of life, and it gives far deeper insights. So we would really move into that direction. And I think, as you alluded in the beginning as well, that we are going to improve on the index. I think this is the first cut. This is the starting point. It is the start of a journey, and we would really look at improving it. But I would maybe come back to a question, and all your suggestions are great, and we will take care of it. But there is this idea or aspect that Dr. Debroy did talk about, and that is about can we really go to taxation rates of the Scandinavian countries? Does India have the fiscal space to really, spend or really look at a pension scheme? Would that be possible? What's your take on this? And Dr. Singh, I would like to request you to answer this question as well.
I think Dr. Debroy has stated the elephant in the room. I think, we have to understand what our fiscal situation is, not only pre-COVID, post-COVID. Our debt levels are 90% of GDP, and there's nothing that we can do which is universal. The fiscal costs are just too prohibitive. And I could not agree more with Dr. Debroy that just to say we need a universal basic income, universal pensions, it's just not fiscally affordable. So I think given that constraint, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how are such programs designed, and how do we means test it? I think that's where the debate should be, not whether they should be universal or not, because we just don't have the fiscal space to make anything universal. And so the question is, what means testing criteria are we going to use? How confident can we be that if you use certain criteria, how many type 1 errors will we make? How many type 2 errors will we make? Where would we like to come out? And I think that's where the debate needs to be focused. Fiscal resources are limited and constrained. We need to use it as intelligently as possible. So I could not agree more with Dr. Debroy. And I think the sooner we get into a more nuanced discussion about how do we means test it, who do we want to target, informal economy, below the poverty line, how much do we want to give to ensure basic quality of life, I think that's where the debate needs to go.
Thank you, Sajid. Dr. Singh, your point.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would agree with Dr. Debroy that ultimately the issue is taxation. And in my opinion, we have to move towards whatever we call it, Scandinavian countries or what have you. We have to move towards a welfare state. We have to raise our levels of taxation because there is no other fiscal space available. In this context, I would just like to mention a couple of other aspects that we've been talking about in today's discussion. One is you talked about the COVID pandemic. To me, the COVID pandemic has done nothing but just speed up all the issues that were already there. There's nothing else it has done. And this is not going to be the only pandemic. We will have a very large number of pandemics coming in the future years. It just speeds up technology, it speeds up a way of addressing issues, it speeds up all the problems that every country has. Having said that, your role as this, Amitji, as you have done by making this report, you've done a very sterling job in putting this issue before public. Now you can just follow up on that, on the same suggestion that Vivek ji just made, which is higher taxation. What do we mean by higher taxation? And in terms of which are the areas that government can fund partially. Today we are technologically advanced, whether it's Aadhaar or it's Jam Trinity or whatever it is, we are technologically advanced to be able to secure and know what is it that we actually want to do and who are the people that we need to address. If we can talk about this on the labor side, we can talk about it on the elderly side also. There is a definitive scheme for social security for labor. Why can't we repeat the same thing here for elderly? It has to be done, it can be done, and it will be done. And in that, your organization has this role of actually converting these ideas into specifics so that people are able to address it and debate it and understand that universal pension is something that has to be the future. And if it means our taxation rates go up to Scandinavian countries, well, it means that. Because we do know that ultimately government has to depend on individuals like you and me to fund this kind of social security arrangement. And this is not something only for the elderly, it's something for the whole country. And we have to learn to address it and accept it. It's going to be very difficult to pass it through parliament, but ultimately it is something that has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Like these are important things. But just one last question to you as well before we just start moving into that wrap up thing for the conversation. So I have to ask you, like, how do you think technology is going to impact the whole idea of how economy, because technology is going to change the way economy is functioning. It is going to change the idea of work. How do you really see that is going to have implications on aging, on people of the future? Because whosoever is in the room, all of us as panelists here, we are all going to cross. Dr. Debroy is there. I presume you're there at the age of 60. I will be there very soon. Sajid would get there very soon. So how do you think it is going to impact us as we move along?
You know, we are the privileged, as Vivek ji was just saying, we are the few which are really like the developed countries. We are this little elite part of India, which is always ahead. And we will do exactly what the rest of the world is doing. We will have technology used by us to rescale, to upscale, to have global learning, to have lifelong learning. That is something which is part of our reality, and we will embrace it. You and I are doing it right now. The fact that we are having this seminar right now in a digital space, we have embraced the technology. So we will do it and we will continue to do it. The issue is more for the others who cannot and do not have this access. That is where government has a role. That is where private sector has a role. And ultimately, it will be this combination of government and private finding this as one more of the issues that have to be addressed as we as a society go ahead.
Dr. Singh, this is very powerful. Just to sum up, we will all have to work together on this. It's going to be the private sector.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We have to make our own, we'll have to make contributions, really making in India a better place as we really go along. And each one of us will have to make a contribution. So that's a very important point. Sajid, your last 3 points, and then like 3 big points or 3 big takeaways of what we should really look at or do.
Dr. Kapoor, let me start by, again, congratulating you. This is an excellent report, a wonderful way to focus the discussion. So it's a great start. I think the 3 points is, we, as Dr. Debroy said, we have to start thinking about day after tomorrow, not just today and tomorrow, and recognize at how quickly we're aging. That has profound macroeconomic implications, as we're seeing in developed markets, in terms of potential growth, in terms of savings rates, in terms of fiscal asks, and start preparing for that. B, because aging is going to be so heterogeneous at the state level, this will have to be a kind of decentralized, state-driven initiative, because different states will come across this at different points in time, of course, helped and enabled by the center. And the third is, both the public and private sector will have to be involved. The state will clearly have a role in providing a stream of income to those that otherwise don't have it. The question is how best, given limited or unlimited, given the absence of unlimited fiscal space, how best we can target those resources to the people that best deserve it. I think these are the questions we have to start anticipating now, because the changes that we seek behaviorally and policy-wise need to get into motion now so that they fructify as the economy rapidly ages.
Thank you, Sajid. Dr. Debroy, 3 big points. What are the?
I don't know whether they're big points, but 3 points. The first is on the digital part of it. We know there is a digital divide. If one is going to be simplistic, one is going to use the rural-urban expression. But I think despite what we say about technology, let us recognize that there is a digital divide, particularly amongst the aged. Many old people are not really comfortable with many instruments that exist in the digital arena, and we need to recognize that. I think the second thing, to borrow an expression used by Sajid out of context, is there is a stock of the aged and there is a flow of the aged. And it is also the fact that many of the aged today, even when they are in a position to do so, have not planned for their old ages. So it is important for the young, who will be the flow of the aged in the future, to plan. One reason for this is something that we have not mentioned earlier in the discussion, which is medical costs. And medical costs, which are often private, medical costs of a new variety of lifestyle diseases, which had not been anticipated for because we had not thought of them. And the last point I want to mention is, when I use the word tax rates, I use the word effective tax rates. So I should not be misunderstood. That could include and will include social security contributions. And many of the high rates of compulsory savings in other countries, and not just because of the tax rates per se, but because of those mandatory contributions which are required to fund the old age benefits.
Thank you, Dr. Debroy. And I think
Kapoor, I'll just take 10 seconds because you asked, and I gave you principles instead of specific recommendations, just to reinforce what I said earlier. How, the 3 things. How do we think about increasing retirement ages? How do we think about increasing women's labor force participation? How do we think of identifying fiscal space? I think those would be 3 tangible measures we can start thinking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Singh, would you like to share something as we move towards the closure? This would be the
No, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So this has just been a fascinating discussion and a very interesting sets of insights. And as I really see it as a step towards really making India a better place for its elderly. I see it as a tool which can really help us focus our energies onto the future. In fact, as what Sajid was saying, it is not for today and tomorrow. It is for day after tomorrow that we have to really look at. In fact, as Dr. Debroy was saying, that it is about understanding the cost implications that are there and how do we really solve it for the people of the future. I think I see this as a beginning of the process, and I'm really looking at really making a contribution over a period of time. Would like to thank Dr. De Broglie and PM EAC or EAC PM to really support us or ask us to do this work. Thanks a lot for joining us for this webinar. It has just been a very fascinating discussion, and I look forward to really moving forward with the work and making better contributions. Thank you once again, Dr. De Broglie, Dr. Singh, Sajid. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Siddharth
you.
and Sajid.